Okay, we are live.
Okay, then I'll check myself as well. Let's see. Yes, working.
Great. Very good, very good. So I guess we don't have much viewers yet, but I will, as always, write in the chat.
Yes. I did notify a few people I know yesterday about their live stream, so
Yes, do that. I will just send some quick notifications as well.
I did notify.
There we go. Yeah. Okay, we have a couple of viewers already, it seems. Hello there. We are glad that you are here, and if you have some topics that interest you particularly, some philosophical topics, then please write them in the comments. Yeah, other than that, we could also propose some topics ourselves. In the last conversation that we had, oh, hello Emil, nice to see you again. In the last conversation that we had three interesting topics that we mentioned. One being that trust is a very important foundation for a functioning society. One was the concept of axioms. So what are axioms and how do we deal with them, perhaps? And one was also the notion of pride and how pride can be a big problem in many circumstances.
Those are deep subjects indeed, and I am open to talk about each of those. So, do you have any preference?
Not yet. Perhaps let's ask the audience if they have a preference of them. Also, of course, if you have some other topic that is on your mind at the moment, some philosophical question, then that would also be interesting.
Yeah.
I guess I would have also another topic, but sorry, speak first.
Oh, it's okay. Right. So I tried to find a suitable topic, but I haven't found a very particular or concrete topic as of yet. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I guess one interesting topic that came up perhaps last weekend. I was at like a dinner with some friends, and this discussion came up, and we ended up kind of moving in on the topic of reality. And there were two people in this group that maintained that there is not one common reality, but that each person has his own reality or her own reality. And I opposed this view strongly, and I was quite I thought about it a lot afterwards, because I feel like this would be an axiom. If there is one reality of which we all are a part, or if there is multiple separate realities that I don't exactly know how that would even be defined or something, but it seems like an axiom that people have to assume at the beginning of their thought process. And I really think that it's very problematic and very destructive for, basically, it seems to be like a pillar of a functioning society, that people assume that they share a common reality, because other than that there is no meaning in the concept of truth, and then there is no meaning in the concept of goodness, and so everything seems to fall apart. And so I would be interested in discussing this idea.
Yes, that would be an interesting and productive topic that I would agree, and I would of course also present reasons why this idea of separate subjective realities is completely false and absurd. But I also see here that Emil has presented some suggestions to the topic: conservative village versus living in big city. That's a very interesting topic. If it's best to live in a conservative village versus living within a big city, no matter whether you are young or elder. Guess that's one suggestion. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, let's give the other viewers a chance to voice their opinion if they want to. I think we have already talked a little bit in some of our previous videos about the distinction between living in a more local community or in a bigger, not exactly in a large city, but more we have discussed the kind of whether communities should be organized more on a local level or more on a national level. It's not exactly the same question. I guess also it might be to some extent a matter of how do you say, of taste, of what you prefer. I'm not sure if I could make an objective argument for the one being better than the other. So I think that the question with reality is very fundamental, and I'm quite interested in it because I feel that many of the false philosophies that people adhere to today have in some form they are based on this starting point, that there is not an objective reality.
Right, yes. Also, it's possible that we could shift topics during the live stream as well, that we could touch upon questions of living locally versus living in a city or out in the countryside. So, yeah, that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, why not do both, one after the other?
Yes, that's true. Okay, seems like there hasn't been any other comments from other viewers yet, so I suppose we could begin to discuss, for instance, the reality question.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Great. So, did you have some initial thoughts, or perhaps you sort of presented some initial thoughts already, or?
Yeah, I could state them again briefly, and I guess the big problem is if there is not an objective reality of which each individual is a part, and of which each individual can know a small part to a small degree by their perception. But if we say that there are really distinct realities, then immediately you also destroy the concept of truth, because truth means a correct description of reality. But if there is not one common reality, then there is also no one truth. But then you hear people say these things like, I have my truth and you have your truth. And of course from this it then also follows that you cannot have a concept of good and evil or right and wrong, because everybody would just have their own moral views. And so part of what I feel is happening here is that people are elevating their own perception or their own perception to reality itself, and they are elevating their own opinion to truth itself. And so it seems kind of a very arrogant thing to do in one sense, but also I think it's very destructive, because you can't really have a conversation with other people if there is not a common reality and a common truth to which you can refer. And so I feel almost as if, and I feel you cannot really live by this philosophy that you are espousing, because of course you still eat bread in the morning and ride your bicycle to the train station. You don't try to eat your bicycle, for example, or just wonder what the hell you should do, because so you cannot really live like this. But I feel almost as if there is some conscious or unconscious motivation behind presenting such an absurd philosophy, and that motivation would be kind of like a Marxist motivation to destroy the structure of the society in which you live.
Yes, I would agree with those points that you made there. So one could sort of point out primarily that, well, this idea of separate realities that might contradict each other is necessarily wrong. It contradicts truth that we know, that self-evident truths. I mean, the very definition of reality is how things really are, how things really exist, in what condition the world around us is organized or structured, you could say. And therefore, it follows necessarily that all parts of reality must be consistent with one another. So therefore, it's impossible to have subjective realities. It's really just destroying the meaning of the word reality, basically. And it's therefore necessarily and self-evidently wrong. And also, yes, no one really believes it, as you pointed out. Everyone in their everyday lives assume that there is this external world around us that we have to relate to, and we have to attempt to correct our own views in conformity with that reality and act based upon that reality. Like you mentioned, every time we nourish ourselves, every time we obtain water, hydration, every time we go to school or job or do anything, we are always assuming that there is this reality that we are engaging, we are interacting, and that's necessarily the case. And even just dialogue itself assume a common reality. So if some person says to another person, well, there isn't really an objective common reality, we all have our own different realities, well, that's really very strange. It's what some would call a performative contradiction. The idea that you are saying something, but by the act of saying it, you are denying what you're saying. Because by dialoguing with someone or discussing or debating with someone, you are, of course, assuming that we are both present in a common reality in which we can speak to each other and we can communicate with each other. And you will receive my messages vocally, and I will receive your messages vocally through this intermedium of this common reality. So just saying that or writing that is a denial of the content of that claim. So yes, it's necessarily wrong and self-refuting. You could point out, and yes, I think it seems to be a part of this this modern liberal or very individualistic idea that the individual is sort of exalted above everything else, that the individual has the right to determine its own reality, so to speak, which is absurd in its very wording. And making the individual self as some sort of God. It reminds me of what Matt Walsh, that political commentator in the United States, said when he tried to define leftism. He defined it as the worship of the self. And that, I think, makes sense when we see all of the different things that leftism does, and also it would explain this idea of perception of the individual being sort of infallibly true for himself. So yes, it's not only is it false and self-evidently false and self-refuting, but it's also destructive and I would say also immoral, because it denies the dignity that things have in objective reality. It elevates human perception far above its natural dignity, trying to treat yourself as a god, and that is immoral, because you cannot treat a creature like God. That's actually blasphemy. And you could also point out, as you said, that it denies any idea of right and wrong. It reduces that to meaningless words. And yes, it's something that people cannot possibly embrace. That view. Yeah.
Yeah, good points that you mentioned there. I like that you brought up the definition, and definition of reality would be that which exists, or the things that really exist, or a description of reality would therefore be describing how things really are. And that necessarily encompasses all of the things that exist. And so if you say that there are multiple different realities, then you have introduced a contradiction directly into the definition of the term. And we have touched on this idea once before in another conversation, that when you insert a contradiction directly into the definition of a fundamental term, and there isn't any term which is more fundamental than reality, because everything happens inside of it. And so by inserting this contradiction, you have basically, you kind of make it impossible to have a logical dialogue about anything, because you can always use the one part of the contradiction to contradict the other, and vice versa. And so you can never make any statement on which you then have to stick with. And so I guess this is really the point of trying to corrupt this very, and Jordan Peterson talks about the logos, and how the logos is the fundamental mechanism by which we can communicate to find out what is true, and to basically deal with reality. And some very radical leftist, kind of Marxist postmodern thinkers call the West a phallogocentric patriarchy. And so they say that the logos is actually a bad thing, and they link it with the patriarchy, which they also call a bad thing, and they profess the aim to destroy these two things. And by inserting a contradiction into the most fundamental definition, you actually achieve the destruction of the logos quite brilliantly, because now you can no longer speak about anything, basically, because every statement could also be true or false based on this contradiction. So I think that's a very important point here.
Right, yes. All rational dialogue and discussion and debate will be destroyed, because if there is no common reality to refer to, then all statements become meaningless. Everything becomes chaotic. Nothing makes sense anymore, by definition. So it's destroying the basis of everything in philosophy and dialogue and discussion. So it cuts right through the core of things that we all have to accept as real and true. So yes, that's certainly the case. And of course, many people could point out how this leads to absurd conclusions that I think very few people would be willing to accept, or perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps there are a great number of people who would say this absurd conclusion, that, for instance, someone would say, well, if that is really the case, then you would have to say that we can't say that the Earth is round. We have to say perhaps the Earth is flat for some people, and the Earth is round for other people. We could never say that it's objectively true that the Earth is round, or that the moon exists, or that the sun exists, or that Australia exists, or that Germany exists. And then, I mean, that's just one of many ways to point out the absurdity, even though I'd say that just saying the idea that there are subjective realities that can contradict each other, it's itself absurd, but of course you can also point out these conclusions. So, yeah, I think that's worth pointing out. And one could, I suppose, relate this false view to this idea of radical skepticism, the idea that we can't know anything with certainty, that everything can be questioned, everything can be disputed, and there is no way to prove that something is true in actual objective reality, because you could always dispute the premises behind that argument or whatever you present in favor of that view. And that would also, of course, be completely destructive, and it would destroy not only its own statement, because that's another thing, it's self-refuting to say we can't know anything for certain. Well, are you certain that we can't know anything for certain? Is it objectively true that we can't know anything for certain? Well, then you are making claims about objective reality, so it's self-refuting that way. But it's that's also destructive, because also there we cannot debate anything or discuss anything. Everything becomes impossible. So that's also a view that has to be combated, the idea that, oh no, we can't know anything for certain. No, that's false. We can actually have access to reality and know certain things. That, of course, doesn't mean that we will know everything about reality, of course not. But there are some things that we can know and safely believe, in other words, and know to be true.
Yes, and and I guess this is an assumption or an axiom that you have to hold if you want to be able to exist in the world and to live. Because as we have said, if you were truly a radical skeptic, then you couldn't interact with the world, because whenever you were hungry, you would have to say, well, I don't actually know if I'm really hungry or if I just feel hungry. Or when you want to eat a piece of bread, you would have to say, I don't know if this bread is edible or not. It might have changed. So it's really, yeah, it's not practicable. And you made two good statements before that I wanted to quickly just kind of follow up on. And the first is that it's actually also a performative contradiction to say to another person that there isn't such a thing as objective reality, because you would basically then have to say, well, either this other person is just a figment of my imagination, or how should a message be transferred, and how could another part of your imagination tell you something which you didn't already know before? So the concept of speaking with someone doesn't really make sense, I guess, in this statement. And I guess also a very important point of this whole thing is this idea of making the individual itself into God. So because you kind of take your own perception and you say, no, this is not just my perception of a bigger thing, something which is bigger than me, but this is actually the whole reality. So I am the master of the entire reality, and also my conviction is the same as the truth. And so, yeah, Jordan Peterson said in some place that this is kind of the mental state of a 2-year-old, because when children go above the age of 2, they typically start to interact with other children on the playground, and that is where they have to learn that they themselves do not define reality, because the other child might object and not be willing to play a certain game in a certain way, and so you have to negotiate the game you are playing as a child so that the other children are willing to play with you as well. And so that's kind of the first point where you definitely have to learn that reality is not just what you perceive or want it to be, but there are things outside of you that influence you. And of course, as you grow older, you should learn this more and more, that you have to adapt yourself to reality. And everybody knows this. That's why it's so frustrating. Like, if it's raining outside, you take a raincoat or an umbrella when you go out. You don't just think, oh no, I will just not believe that it's raining and then I will be dry or something like that. So you know perfectly well that you have to adapt yourself to reality. And yeah, so I guess these are some important thoughts.
Yes, indeed. And also with those viewpoints, one could never say things like, today I learned something new. No one can learn anything. There is no basis for education or any kind of learning, any kind of knowledge. One could never say that, say, people who study physics, they don't have any more knowledge about the nature of matter and particles than some peasant in the 15th century, because you can never learn anything about objective reality according to that view, so it becomes completely absurd. And also this idea, I've heard that when you point out perhaps that this is when you point out that it's a performative contradiction to say, oh, we can't know anything or we have our own realities, well, then of course that's a contradiction, because you are assuming that in the very act of speaking or saying those words, well, some would, I suppose, say, and there are some who believe this, that, well, we simply talk to each other and assume this for the sake of convenience. It's pragmatic that we assume a common reality because that's practical. We wouldn't get very far without it. Well, first of all, you could ask why. Why is it pragmatic? Why is it practical and useful and convenient to assume a common reality? How do you know that that would actually help the discussion? Only if there is a common reality which would make it practical. Because on what basis do we say this is practical and this is not, if there isn't some objective fact about the nature of discussion as such? So that also becomes a self-fulfilling idea, this idea that, oh, it's only practical or pragmatic. No, it doesn't make sense, because also then you're assuming, well, what is the basis for that practicality or pragmatic nature? Again, reality. So, by the way, there is a new comment here by Lopos, and he writes, "Great show, guys." Well, thank you. "I would like to hear your perspectives on philosophy behind geopolitics, a very relevant topic of today." Interesting. Thanks for the comment. What are your thoughts both on what I discussed and also the comments?
Yes, I think let's take this, which is an interesting question, and thank you for the comment, Lopos. Let's take it up for after we have finished with discussing about reality. So then we could talk also about the philosophy behind geopolitics and also about this question whether you should live in a small village or a large city. After we have finished this topic, I guess that would be a good approach. Okay. So then, to what you were saying. Yes, it's an important point that you made there, that you cannot learn something new if you assume that your perception is reality, is synonym to reality, or the content of your consciousness is equal to reality. Because you cannot then learn something, because learning means that something comes into your consciousness, but then it must have come from somewhere. And so it must have already been there, in which case you would have already known it. And in the same token, you also cannot change your mind. Because, how should that exactly work? Where should the change come from? What should affect the change if there is nothing except that which you yourself already contain? And I guess I was thinking just before, because it's very frustrating and annoying to talk with these kind of people, and it doesn't lead anywhere. I guess perhaps the right reaction would be to simply say, look, I do not talk with people who think that I do not exist as an individual entity. I will not be willing to have a conversation if you do not grant me moral agency and individual existence outside of your consciousness. I will just not be willing to have this sort of interaction.
interesting point. Yeah, this one of these philosophies that would entail such a thing is solipsism, which is this idea that only you exist. You are the only agent in reality, and everything you see around you is a figment of your imagination, or at least something that exists within your mind. Sort of like the only thing that is reality is you, who is sort of I suppose, some sort of God, who just has some ideas, and that's all reality is, basically, it seems to me, according to solipsism. And yes, I mean, if someone says, well, I'm a solipsist, one could say, well, okay, then I suppose we can't have a conversation then, because I don't exist, in your view. So that's an interesting point. Thanks for a good discussion, guys. Yeah, thank you very much for that comment.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and the interesting point is you cannot disprove solipsism or rational skepticism. You cannot disprove it because they have a different axiom at the start of their thinking. But I think I totally agree with what you were saying. You should just say to such a person, yeah, well then, I guess we won't have a conversation because you don't even believe that I exist. And so I guess part of the problem, and I'm prone to this myself, is being too agreeable and putting up with completely absurd statements by other people and treating them with the respect that you would treat a conversation partner who makes sensible statements. Because actually what you should just say is, this is absurd, and yeah, I cannot have a conversation with you on this ground, and that's the end. Or one thing I was also thinking about, which I wouldn't advise it, but I still think it would be very funny, if you would just get up and slap this person in the face. They would probably be very upset. And then you could say, well, why are you upset? In my reality, nothing bad has happened. So again, people don't live by what they say, and when you treat them in conversation still as if they are intelligible conversation partners, then I think you're kind of doing something wrong yourself at that point.
Yeah, what you could say about the idea of slapping someone in the face is that according to the perspective that there is an objective reality, you could make an argument that, well, that would contradict human dignity. But if you believe that there is no common reality, it's just subjective so-called realities, well, then you lack a basis on which to object. So one who believes in objective reality, well, we can have an argument why that's not good, but not the one who denies it. So yes, that's a good point. And yes, it involves absurdities on several levels. That's very true. So yes, one has to admit then that there is an objective reality. We can discover how it is. We can acquire knowledge about it, and that's something everyone assumes in their everyday lives, and we know it to be the case. So I hope that people would simply be honest about it in also what they profess to believe in. So
let's perhaps, if I may, quickly deal with the question of, because I agree with what you have just said, so what would be the motivation for people to make such statements? Since they can't truly rationally believe it or live by it, what is the motivation behind it?
That's a very good question. Well, one idea could be that some people, well, I mean, one could sort of say that, well, some people have held on to this view for a time, and they are not humble enough to admit that, oh, they have been really deceived for a long time, so just cling on to that belief because of pride or something. But then you could also ask the question, well, how did they obtain that view in the first place? So it is a good question. I would say that those who sincerely believe that there is no objective reality, they would be blinded in some way, because it's obvious to everyone. Everyone really knows that there is objective reality, so they would be dishonest with themselves, and you could say they are blind in a spiritual way. Exactly the way in which one would be deceived, or what would be the cause of that deception? Well, there would be some bad will on the part of the person not really seeking the truth, not really caring about being honest and rational in his view of thinking. That yes, the person would not be willing to think rationally, would abandon rationality in some things, and that would produce such that would then involve such deception or blindness. Perhaps that would be very general statements about how people could end up like this. But if you're talking about particular, very concrete circumstances, well, I'm not sure. Perhaps some simply do not care about rationality in those cases because they have heard other people in their area or friends or whatever hold this view, and they want to be popular among them, so they hold this view as well. Or some, there could be different reasons, but at least I think it has to do with not being willing to be rational and honest with oneself, and that's a moral problem actually. So
yeah, very good points that you made there, and I particularly agree that that a moral problem lies at the root of it, and it would be something, as you said, like bad will, like not seeking the truth or not seeking goodness, not wanting to be good. And I guess it has something to do like with the denial of responsibility also. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this when he says that if there is no objective reality, then there is no objective truth, and then there is no objective good or evil or obligation or responsibility as an individual. You can just do whatever you want. And so if you don't want to put in the effort and try to be a good human being, then one way to justify that you are not trying it is to make some sort of convoluted philosophical argument, and this would be a prime example of such an escape, like saying, well, there is no objective reality, and so basically I can do whatever I want. I guess that would be one possible motivation for this sort of thing. Of course, as you said, peer pressure might also be a problem. I guess also another motivation that I could see is that people actually want to produce conflict. Because when you destroy the ability of settling disputes or disagreements by speech and by rational interaction and by referring to a common reality and a common set of ethics, then you create conflict, because if the dispute cannot be settled in a civilized and good manner, then it will grow and escalate, and at some point perhaps there will be physical violence, and in the end, as we said, a society cannot function without people accepting a common reality and a common norm of good and evil. And so if you destroy these things, then perhaps you actually hate the society in which you live and you want to destroy it or change it fundamentally, and destroying it would be the first step. And so I guess that would also be a moral failing. That would also be akin to something like bad will or having evil motives for doing what you are doing.
Yes, good point. So I think there is a link between modern leftist revolt against civilization and the denial of objective reality, and also this idea that all people want to be free to do whatever they want and not be held responsible or be willing to humble themselves or correct themselves according to reality, that they simply want to do whatever they want and determine how reality is. It's also a motivation. Yes, I think that is true.
And so, if I may, just one short addition, I guess most of the people who hold these views or who speak them out do not consciously have the aim of destroying the entire society or of denying their responsibility. I guess it would more be the case that they are somehow subconsciously drawn towards this philosophy, because basically they just want to escape from their responsibility or are not happy with the state of society. But I wouldn't ascribe these motives that I have mentioned consciously to most people who hold or profess such a philosophy. But still, I think that this is the end point to which this philosophy tends. And I guess there are a few select kind of masterminds who actually know that it leads there and who consciously spread it for this purpose. But I guess most of the people who adhere to it in day-to-day life or who profess it wouldn't consciously hold these goals in mind necessarily.
Interesting points. And also an additional comment could be that we see the application of these denials of objective truth in things like transgenderism. The idea that men can be women, women can be men. That she is a woman because she feels like it, and etc. So we also see applications of that to particular issues. By the way, do you think we should move on to some of the topic suggestions that, for instance, Lopez suggested, or do you have some additional thoughts, or what do you think?
Yeah, I would just agree with you that we see many applications of this, let's call it poisonous philosophy that now start to manifest themselves in reality. And as you said, transgenderism would be one of these manifestations. I guess we could, and we have named other examples in past conversations. Just not any particular one coming to my mind. But yeah, I guess this would be good for this part, and let's go to the question of philosophy behind geopolitics. So perhaps what are your initial thoughts on this?
Well, I would say that geopolitics, it's not really a subject about which I have a lot of opinions or a lot of ideas necessarily. Because the thing about geopolitics is that it seems very contingent upon historical circumstances, different social circumstances, economic circumstances, which make it, which contribute to developing a certain condition in which different countries in different parts of the world are placed. They're placed in such circumstances. For instance, now we see that Russia is in such a state, and we see that the United States is in such a state, etc., because of many different contingencies throughout history: economic development, historical things like wars and peace treaties, and different economic systems. All these things play into creating this geopolitical atmosphere that we have today. So I suppose that would perhaps be more of an historical or economic or political point of view rather than a philosophical point of view. Though one could make deep, you could say, philosophical judgments about, well, what is, for instance, Russia all about? What is its ideological basis? What is the relation between Western civilization and the Russian society, or China, or other places? What is the relationship between Russia and the Middle East and the Islamic countries of the world? Many issues that can be discussed on a very deep level, but again, I think many of these things are based upon contingencies, which seems to be more in the realm of history, economics, political science than philosophy. Though I would be interested in hearing people's thought about, what can we say about Western civilization in contradistinction to, say, Russia or China? That would be interesting, but yeah, those would be my initial thoughts. What do you think?
Yes, I think it's an interesting question, and I guess I would have agreed with your statement perhaps 2 years ago, but now I actually think that there are some philosophical, how do you say, that philosophy plays an important role in this, and you have mentioned the way that it plays an important role in this, which is the ideological basis of different societies. And there is an author named Arnold J. Toynbee who has written a book, A Study of History. And this is, I think, an absolutely fantastic book. And in this book, he deals with the question of the rise and fall of civilizations. And he roughly defines a civilization as all the societies, either locally or over time, spread throughout human history, that have the same philosophical core or the same ideological core. And so, for example, he calls Western Christendom one civilization, or he calls the Islamic nations one civilization, or he calls the Hellenistic civilization, which one consists of all the Greek and Roman states. Or there would be different different civilizations also in the Far East and also around India. Egypt would have been a civilization, and also a couple of civilizations in South America. And so I guess, and his point is that a civilization is healthy as long as it's this ideal or this religion basically, which is at its core, is healthy and is up to date and being actualized in reality. And when a society loses its core, then it starts to decay and eventually dies, or a civilization, I should have to say. And so I guess there is an important aspect of the average morality of the population of a society would determine, in my view, the trajectory that this society is on. So if many people in a society truly try to be good human beings, then there is a high chance, at least, that this society will improve and become better and richer and larger and more beautiful. And also, if many people adhere to or do evil things and just try to increase their own profit by any means possible, then this society would start to decay. And I guess, globally speaking, we see a lot of societies or people trying to improve their own material state by any means possible. And I guess that would lead to the state of the world that we see at the moment. So I guess these would be my initial thoughts.
Interesting. Perhaps then one could say that philosophy, one of the areas in philosophy, is reflecting upon the nature of society. What is a society made of? What is its basic structure? Political philosophy, obviously, about the nature of government, and talking about different forms of government, etc. And when one sort of philosophizes about that and discovers truths about what would be a healthy society, what would be the natural tendencies of that society, etc., then you could talk about different geopolitical scenarios as applications of those truths. You could say, well, we see that Russia is in a state it is because of this and this and this and this, and that is an application of the nature of society. The nature of society is such that when this happens and this happens, it will lead to this. When this happens, it will lead to this, and this is precisely what we have seen with Russia. Therefore, there is this link in that way. And also the opposite way, that we see the geopolitical structure or scenario around the world, and that can give us information into what is the social fabric of society, what is the nature or natural tendencies of societies or human beings or governments. So that can help us gain knowledge into the structure of society itself. Because one thing to note about knowledge, generally speaking, is you could say that we are sort of deriving universals from particulars. We look at the world around us and we see many different things with our senses. And we see particular concrete things, but then by means of having knowledge about these particular concrete things, we discover deeper truth about the nature of the different, of a specific category of things, class of things. We see many trees, and thus we can make judgments about what is the tree essentially. We see many human beings, and we can make judgments about, well, what is human nature? We see many societies, and thus we can make judgments about society, etc. So I think this hierarchical development of our access to reality, that by means of more direct, sensible truths, like seeing things with our five senses, we receive deeper, more universal knowledge. I think this goes all the way back to Plato, perhaps even earlier, but it's Plato. And that could be said of geopolitics as well. It's a direct way in which we could perhaps reach deeper knowledge. What do you think about that?
Yes, very interesting points that you made there. Yeah, I guess I would agree that society reflects the philosophy that the members of this society hold. Like the state of a society reflects the philosophy that these people live by. And so if you think about what would be a healthy society, or what would be true or correct principles by which a society should be organized, or that it should adhere to in its action, then this adhering to these true principles would lead to being in a better state, whereas adhering to false principles would lead to being in a worse state. And of course, when you formulate like this, it sounds like self-evident that if you build a society on false moral principles, then it will not work very well. And if you build it on true principles, it will work better. And this then radiates outwards. And of course, the same goes for interacting with another society. So there would be true principles of interaction between societies, like if you make a treaty, then you should hold your word, and then you will gain more respect or more credibility with other societies, and they will be more willing to trust you. Whereas if you violate your word as a society, then they won't trust you in the future. And so I think these kinds of things are very important and are what I meant. And of course also your statement that that knowledge means deriving universals from particulars, I think is a very well put observation and very important. And in that sense, we can derive perhaps certain principles about how societies should behave by looking at the geopolitical landscape and seeing how things went for different societies who behaved in different ways.
Interesting observations. Right, and one could say that, well, there are general philosophical judgments about the relation between governments. For instance, two governments which think more alike will have a higher inclination of being friends rather than foes. Perhaps that's an example of how one could, I suppose, present philosophical truths, which would be very relevant to geopolitical analysis. By the way, we also have a new commentary by St. Augustine, or Augustine, 560 set X. I can just read it very quickly. Is it immoral to want a minimum material/economic living standard? It seems easy as a Westerner to suggest wanting more, quote, materialism is immoral. Did you want to comment about the geopolitical issue, or just go and comment on these comments here?
Yeah, I might address this comment specific. Of course, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that people shouldn't desire to have a minimum or even an improved economic / material living standard. What I was talking about is the means that people think are acceptable or proper to reach this goal. Because people in a certain society might, by and large, think I would want this society to function better and I would want my material standard to be higher. Therefore, I will get up in the morning and work harder and try to cooperate with my other fellow citizens as best as I can in order to improve things. Or they could say, well, I just have to be part of the small group that is in power so that I can exploit all the rest of my members of my society so that I will have a high material / economic living standard. And the first approach, which I believe to be objectively good and moral, will, if enough people in this society choose it, will lead to a better state of this society. Whereas if enough people in this society choose the second approach and try to get rich at the expense of their neighbor, then the society will devolve more and more or remain poor.
Interesting observations. Also, I was a little bit unsure about whether that comment was a suggestion to a new topic, but it seems like it was more a comment on what you said about societies and civilizations. Right, yes, so perhaps one could add that a good society or a strong society is one in which people would be willing to make sacrifices for the overall improvement of that society, whether materially or culturally or spiritually. So sacrifice is an important part in building up a good society. So
yeah, that reminds me of an interesting thought that is also particularly inspired by Jordan Peterson, but I think I kind of pulled it a little bit further, that actually the right mode of being, of interacting with the world, is to make sacrifices yourself in order to improve the world. And I guess that the opposite approach would be to sacrifice other people or to sacrifice the world in order to improve the state of yourself. And so when you see evil people, they typically want to sacrifice someone else's well-being and happiness or material possession in order that they themselves have more. Whereas when you see people who we conceive as being moral actors, then they would typically make sacrifices themselves in order to improve their own state or the state of the world around them.
yes, interesting points. And this concerns the fundamental principles of what distinguishes a good or strong society versus a bad society. This willingness to make sacrifices for the betterment of society as a whole, etc. And also I would refer briefly to this approach which I've argued for previously, that when we look to what does a good society consist of, we should thinking of trying to conform that society to a specific kind of natural order, an order which would fulfill the human nature and human natural needs of all its members. Similar to how when you have a sick body, the primary goal should be to restore that body to a healthy natural state, which is ordered. Similar to a society, if you have a bad or sick society, you should try to restore it or change it into conforming to some natural order. So I believe very much in that principle. And that natural order would involve a good family structures, a good culture, and of course I would add the true religion as well, and different spiritual values connected to that, virtues, and also economically, that there should be this natural structure of economics. There should be a significant element of decentralization. There should be a natural balance between bureaucracy and people having their own individual independent means to sustenance, etc. So I believe very much in this principle of a natural order to which society should conform. And that's another problem, I would say, with many of the modern political approaches, that it's very much about, well, let's look at GDP, let's look at all these statistics, and let's look at, okay, how can we increase this unit, and how can we deal with this mathematical, statistical variation, and that's very misleading. That's not what society is about. It's about conforming to a natural order, not simply increasing, producing this amount of things or this amount of, or this income and production and all these different statistics are not really the essence of society. You could say they are effects of different things or aspects of different things, but not the natural order itself. So I think much of modern political discourse is very flawed because they don't have the right approach. And that could also be applicable to geopolitics. That's when people are talking about, well, how should geopolitics be? We need to have the right approach about, okay, what is the natural order to which different countries should be organized, in what state, and of course also what should be the relation between different governments in a natural state. You could perhaps say that, well, this philosophy of Machiavelli, that the government should only think about its own interest rather than trying to conform to some ideal. I think that's very much flawed. I think that's a huge problem to think in this way. We should try to think about, okay, to the degree it's possible and practical and feasible, you should try to have relations between governments which would promote the natural order and well-being of societies.
Yeah, very good point. Both of them, I guess. The first one is more about society itself, and I would very much agree that there is a sort of human nature, that human beings have a certain nature, and by this nature certain things are good for them and allow them to flourish, and other things are bad for them and hinder them from flourishing. And a good society should have internally a structure that allows all of its members to fulfill these needs that come from their human nature and to live according with their human nature. And I also particularly liked your second point, that we should apply this principle then to geopolitics or international relations as well. This seems to be a big problem today, that most countries, and not only the governments but also the people within these countries, the population, they seem to think that, yeah, well, we just want to enhance our own desires at the expense of other countries because we don't really give a shit about them. And that's not an approach that will lead to a good interaction with another entity if you don't care at all about their needs and their desires. And so I guess if people came into the habit of, and governments then by representing the people, to deal with different governments or with other societies in a way that should be for the mutual benefit of both parties, instead of trying to force your own will onto the other and extract something from them against their will. But you should say, no, we need to interact in a way that we can have a society where our members can fulfill their natural needs, and at the same time you as another society should have the same possibility as well. Then I guess that would lead to different interactions, indeed, yes.
Right, and also that you should promote peace between nations, and also that, yes, even though you have countries which do not conform to the natural law in very notorious and grave ways, you should still try to think about, well, still, insofar as we're talking about our country's relation to that country, we should have peace and harmony. So I oppose very much this idea of, for instance, the United States government or military being the world police. I don't think that's natural or good. So Yes, such principles, but we have these ideals we should conform to, and not trying to think in these Machiavellian terms of, well, what can we get out of it? How can we increase this and that? How can we exploit this and that? No, try to think of the overall health and moral condition of your society. That is what you need to think about. So that should be the approach, I would say, to that. Right, so I'm not sure if I have very much more to add about that subject, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would have one addition to what you have said, and to which I agree. But I guess wanting to promote peace doesn't mean that you are never willing to engage in war. There might be reasons or situations, there might be situations in which it's unavoidable. And if someone wants to bully you, if that's another country that wants to bully you, then you have to resist. You shouldn't. It's not the appeasement politics idea. It's very dangerous and it doesn't work. So that's not, I guess, what we are saying here. But I guess the important thing would be that you, as a country, have good intentions, truly good intentions when you are dealing with other countries. It's like this idea, there's this very difficult idea in Christianity that you should pray for your enemies. And I guess it has something to do with this, that you shouldn't just want that which is good for yourself, but you should also want that which is good for the other party with which you are interacting, even if this party is hostile to you at the moment. Because if you have really good intentions, then I guess over the long run, this will lead to a better state of society and also of international relations than if you have actually bad intentions and the intention of really exploiting another country, because that will lead to very different behavior, even in war and even in conflict. And so I guess that's the important point.
Right, yes, there is this philosophical tradition called the just war theory, promoted by Christian philosophers like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, talking about the conditions which have to be in place in order to justify war, because in certain cases war can't be justified if it's the last resort, etc. to many things, and those are relevant to think about. And yes, to the principle about willing the good of others, not yourself only. Yeah, I think that's a very good. It's true and good principle, and it's something that is central to Christianity, and I think that would also impact significantly countries' approach to other countries, because they think that, well, these people in that country, they're also made in the image and likeness of God. They are valuable human beings. We have to take that into account. So yeah, I think that's also important. So yeah.
Yes, I also don't have anything to add to this particular question, so perhaps let's address the early comment by Emil about the difference between living in a conservative village versus living in a big city. Yeah, what are your initial thoughts again?
Right, so I would say that there are various benefits for human beings to live out in the countryside, that it would be more in conformity with their nature and their natural tendencies compared to the city, generally speaking. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's wrong or necessarily harmful to live in a city, but rather that it would be more beneficial to live on the countryside as a general rule. Though, of course, we could talk about exceptions, etc., but generally, because I would say that when you live out in the countryside, for instance, you have more access to nature. It's much easier to go out in the woods and be surrounded by beautiful natural surroundings. I can confirm that by personal experience, by living in the countryside myself. And that's particularly healthy also for children to grow up in an environment where there is a lot of natural surroundings, woods they can run out to, build huts, etc. Many things that you would not have in the city. And nature is natural for human beings in a way. You could say that it's good for the human being to be surrounded by that. And also it's more peaceful, you don't have all the traffic, and I think it's more natural for human beings to be surrounded by peaceful and calm environments than those which would have much noise or traffic or chaos. So yeah, I think these are some of the reasons why one would say that it's generally more beneficial to live in the countryside compared to the city. So that is my view about that subject.
Yeah, I guess my first comment is I think it's to a large degree a question of preference. And I guess also that it depends on the details. So it is, in my mind, absolutely possible to have basically a village in which people interact on good moral principles, and to have a city in which people interact on evil, selfish principles. But the opposite is also possible. So perhaps the anonymity of the city might make it a little bit more probable that some people will behave in an immoral manner, but I'm not entirely sure if that is true, because you could also make an argument that because the village is quite small, people can kind of behave in a bad manner and still be needed by the other members of this village. Whereas if you are a shop in a big city and you don't treat your customers well, then they will never come again. So I guess there could be pros and cons to both of it. I would agree with what you said, Christopher, that it's good for kind of for the well-being of people to spend time in nature, but that might be also a personal preference. I'm not exactly sure, although I think to some extent it would be good for people, just because that's the way we have lived for most of our existence as a species, and so it kind of calms the soul, I guess, if you are in contact with a calm and peaceful nature. But on the other hand, I also think that the countryside can sometimes be intellectually very, very dead. There is just sometimes small villages, they have just like a baker and a butcher and a couple of farmers, and there aren't any real positions for intellectuals in a small village, because all the jobs that people do there have to do with very basic physical needs, like building a house or I don't know, repairing a car or something like that. And so I guess for me that would be a problem, because I am kind of an intellectual type.
Well, I would multiple things to be said. First is that I would say that there are additional benefits to living on the countryside that touch upon, one of them touches upon what was you were talking about, anonymity and having communal bonds, you could say. In a city, it's easier to be anonymous, and it's easier to have social relations which are very, very flexible and very easy to shut off. But if you live out in the countryside, especially if you have been raised in a village, then it's much easier to have strong and stable communal bonds, and it makes it more. It's easier than to have social bonds in which people will be there for each other and not be that much inclined to get away from that bond if there is some inconvenience. So people would be more inclined to have certain bonds and not just leave if it's inconvenient or some conflict, and that therefore promotes an environment in which you could have stable long-term social bonds, and therefore people know each other on a deeper level. Obviously that can happen in the city too, but I think it's easier, it seems generally speaking better to have it in the countryside. And also it's interesting about the countryside because you could sort of both have these strong communal bonds, but at the same time, it's also easy to, if you want to live alone and be in solitude, because you don't have all the traffic and all the noise outside. So you could also, if you want to, live in solitude in the countryside. So it's a very interesting way in which you can have both options in a way. So that was one thing, and also another thing is that it's also safer out in the countryside because, for instance, there is less traffic, and therefore it's less probable for people to end up in accidents like traffic accidents. Let's say you grow up in the city and you are a teenager, for instance, and you're going to meet a friend in that city, but then you have to cross a lot of traffic to get there. Well, it would be safer if that happened on the countryside, because then you could, I suppose, just take your bicycle or just walk to another house where your friend lived. And it's, I suppose, generally safer when it comes to traffic accidents and other things to live in the countryside when people are moving. So yes, it's true that there are less choices insofar as we're talking about businesses. There are fewer businesses, fewer stores, fewer, for instance, bakers and other things like you said, than in the city. But at the same time, you also have the benefit of the possibility to a large degree of having communal bonds with those people in those businesses. I think it's a beautiful thing when you grow up in a society, a village, for instance, and you go to the baker and you know the baker very well. You know him your whole life. But in the city, it's much more easy to be very anonymous and not know that many people in those local communities or businesses. And it seems also that in the city, things change a lot easier. Suddenly that business is gone and there's a new business there, and now that building is torn down and replaced with a new one. But out in the countryside, things are more stable and less changing, and therefore easier for people to cultivate long-term social relationships, etc.
Yeah, interesting point. It reminds me of a conversation that we had also some time ago about the problems with anonymity and the importance of having strong bonds with other human beings. And I guess to some extent I agree with you that it's in the city it's easier to have to have no deep bonds with anyone, but just to have very superficial contact, or even to just use like some entertainment services like the cinema, or like all kinds of things that you can do where you can pass your time without having really long time connections with other human beings. So I guess you can of course have such connections also in a city, but it's easier perhaps to live in a way where you don't have them. And so that might be a problem for some people. And on the other hand, of course, when you live in a small village, there might be some person whom you really can't stand, and you still have to interact with them on a regular basis because they are also part of this village, and kind of keep running into them. And I'm not even saying that this necessarily has to be a bad thing. It might be good for your development of your character, but certainly it will be annoying, and you might wish to have just to not have this interaction and have interactions with people whom you find more pleasant or more interesting. And I guess you cannot deny that it's safer because just the density of people is less, and so there will be less accidents and less crime. And also it will be more stable, and some people like that, and some people like the rapid change and always having something new. So that's also a little bit personality dependent. But I guess for me the real thing is in a city I will almost definitely at least have the option of finding some people who are also intellectually really interesting to talk to, Whereas I do feel that in the rural areas this is sometimes more difficult, though I might be prejudiced, but I kind of feel that it is. Also, for example, universities tend to be in big cities because you just need a large enough amount of people so that it's even feasible to have something like a university, because just in a village you have a primary school and you don't have a university.
Well, when you pointed out the issue about meeting others who might be very interested in philosophy or intellectual subjects, generally speaking, it might be easier to find such people in a city compared to the countryside. Well, I suppose that would make sense. I don't have a strong counter-argument to that. Of course, I do believe it's possible to find such people at the countryside as well, but since there are more people in the city, it's statistically more probable finding someone like that in the city. But I would still say that it would be that factor would be outweighed by all the other benefits of living in the countryside. Therefore, I would say that still overall, it's generally speaking better. And also, I suppose one could say, well, there are ways to deal with finding people who live far away from you, but with whom you have joy in having contact with. For instance, today you have social media, so you could argue that, well, today it's not that big of a problem because just like we too, we have this Zoom meeting, but I'm always doing that while I'm in the countryside. So people could argue that, well, due to the internet, it's not really that much bigger of a deal. And if we're talking about a really conservative society where we don't have this internet connection, well, you could talk about sending letters, which is actually kind of charming. The idea of sending letters where you write long pages of, perhaps you have some very deep philosophical ideas that you want to write down, several pages, and you send it as a letter. And then you wait, I don't know, 2 weeks perhaps, and then you get a response, and it's a very long letter with his views and all that. I think that would be very interesting and charming and beautiful to have such a norm reestablished. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true what you say with the internet, and also I think actually it has some advantages, this thing with writing a long letter, because you really have to think it through and write it very carefully. Whereas with social media today, people just type something and send it immediately, and so the quality of the discourse has often deteriorated a lot. I guess that's true. Still, for me, it's important enough to have intellectual exchange, so I wouldn't want to miss it. But of course, you can also live close to a city and regularly go into the city and still live in a somewhat kind of countryside, which is, I think, what many people actually prefer and what I prefer as well. But for me, it has much to do with preference. It doesn't really have that much to do with philosophical principles. So I don't have much more to say about it.
Right. So I would also say that though I believe that it's better for human beings according to nature to be out in the countryside, that doesn't mean that there can be, of course, situations in which people can have a good life while living in the city, or that it's necessarily wrong to live in the city. No, of course, that doesn't follow it, but it's rather a judgment about whether one is better than the other compared to the other. So now there is one more benefit to living in the countryside, which people have argued, and I think that's a significant issue, and that is that it's less, or it's more difficult to get away with immoral behavior out in the countryside, because it's much easier for people to know about you committing certain immoral things. Let's say a person living in the countryside commits adultery. It will be easier for other people to detect that and know about it and react against that, and therefore have certain social consequences, compared to the city where things are much more anonymous. Now, you might perhaps say, well, what about the village which have bad values, where people recognize values that are not good? And if you try to live virtuously, well, people will react negatively against that. Well, I suppose I could imagine such a society, but I would still say that it seems that the tendency of society would to have at least some true good social norms that will be recognized. So I don't think it will be that much of an issue when you're talking about comparing country life to city. So, and also our approach should be that, okay, what would be, if we consider a good village versus a good city, the good village would still be better in that regard compared to the good city, if both have good moral norms, according to this hypothetical premise. So I would consider that another important benefit for living in the countryside. But yes, I don't think I have much more to. Yes, okay, one thing to add, and that's perhaps not that much to do with countryside, but rather what you mentioned about exchanging letters compared to internet. Yes, that's a very good point, and I agree with that. I think it's better and more productive and substantial and well-made communication is made through letters compared to social media platforms. So I would be in favor of having more and more letter exchange and less of social media exchange to the degree that would be feasible. So, but that is perhaps another topic, though. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree with your point that it's more difficult to get away with immoral behavior in a smaller community than in a larger community. At least, I guess, it's more difficult to get away without being noticed, because people know almost everything about their neighbors because there are not that many people around, and so the information spreads faster and reaches everyone, and then there will be consequences. In another way, however, it is also easier to get away with bad behavior because there is less competition. So, for example, I have often wondered why, if you, sometimes on vacation when we are really in the countryside, there are like very small villages, and people have just huge piles of trash in their garden, or their houses are looking really poor, or they walk around with very ugly clothes. And these are things that you don't really see in more densely populated areas. And I guess the reason for this is, as I said, if I have the choice between two shops or between 100 shops, and one shop has a very poor customer service, or just it isn't really clean, it doesn't really look nice, then I just immediately won't go there anymore. And so the competition also forces people to up their game, to dress nicely, to clean their house, to kind of look appropriate for a human society. Whereas if you live somewhere out in nowhere and you are just one of the 100 people with whom the other people can interact, then they even also have to interact with you if you dress really poorly. And so there are pros and cons also, I think, in this dimension.
Well, I in my experience, there have been counter examples of there being great things in the countryside that perhaps some would say that has something to do with the countryside, that it promotes better environments. But perhaps I'm not necessarily that much knowledgeable about you could say examples of quality out in the countryside compared to the city. But well, I see the point about competition, but you could perhaps also argue that on the other hand, in the city, since there are far more people, there is going to be overall much more consumer demand, and that's going to be beneficial for the business owners. But out in the countryside, there's going to be less customers, and therefore consumer demand will be lower, and that's going to be a disadvantage for business owners. So perhaps one could make the argument that that it goes either way, I suppose, that there are things that business owners out in the countryside have to consider because, I don't have that many customers as I would in the city, and therefore he has to be more careful in that regard, so that there could be sort of counterbalances in that sense. or you could say that it's more costly to run businesses in the city because there's much more demand for buildings, etc. So yes, it's true that you could have perhaps more competition in one sense, but in another sense, it would be more costly to run those businesses because of the expensive price of buying locations. While out in the countryside, it's going to be cheaper to have a location, and therefore that's going to be a counterbalance to the, you could say, the easiness, if that's a proper word, of establishing businesses in countryside. But yeah, that's at least some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I would have to disagree with this theory that you have just presented. I think you are making an error here in the, yeah, I guess competition tends to improve the quality of service. And of course, it's true that buildings are more expensive in the country, in the city than in the countryside. But of course, you will also have more customers coming into your shop, and so that will change. That will be on the plus side. So the question is not: is it cheaper to open a business in the countryside versus in the big city? But the question is, how does competition affect the quality of the goods and services that are offered? And if you have 100 shops in a city, or let's say if you just have 2 shops and one shop can take over the customers of the other shop, then that will be a huge improvement in its income, and therefore that's what we mean when we say competition is stronger. And so the point is, of course, that when one shop closes in the city, the customers go to this other shop which had a better quality, and this other shop expands and becomes larger. But in the countryside, if the village is small enough, then there is just room for 1 or 2 shops because there is not more demand, because there are not more people. And so even if the shop is not very great, perhaps you still go there because you have no alternative. And so that's what is meant by having less competition, and that means the quality of the goods can be lower and still people are willing to buy them, because else they would have to, for example, drive a long way into another village. And also it's more difficult for a competitor to open a second shop, because if you have one shop and you open another one and you get, let's say both get half of the customers, then you can't actually live from this revenue. But in the city, when you have 100 shops and you open the 101st shop, then even if you only get a small percentage of the total customers, it's already enough for you to exist as a shop. And then when you are good, you can grow.
Well, those are interesting considerations, and those might be advantages for a customer in the city. But I'm not quite sure still. Perhaps you could make the counter argument that, well, yeah, there might be few business owners and few customers in the countryside, but still, if that business owner sees you doing a very bad job, then there is at least a possibility of their establishing a competitor in that area, and then the customers will go to him instead. And since it's a small community and people will know each other relatively well, then it's much easier for that to happen in an effective and dynamic way and have deliberate plans about it, because now it's a small community where people know each other and there will be repercussions much more directly, you could say. So, and also another thing is that you could, I suppose, say that, well, it depends a bit on what kind of business it is. If it is a business in which the raw materials are easily accessible in the countryside, that will be a different scenario than if you have to bring them over a certain distance. And you could argue that, well, if you have businesses selling things which are easily made or accessed out in nature, then it will be less of a problem out in the countryside compared to the city, where you have to transport things over a relatively longer distance. And also another point is that if you're talking about businesses that are. Yeah, that's perhaps another issue. Businesses that have long distances and multiple shops at multiple cities or multiple places. But that's perhaps not exactly what we're talking about right now. So, yeah, that would be my views on that.
Yeah, still, I think you're kind of mixing some things up a little bit. For example, it's not, it's exactly not the case that things change more dynamic in the country than in the city. And so, of course, if someone has a shop and this shop does an absolutely terrible job, then someone might open up a second shop and take away all the customers and the first shop will close. But in order for this to happen, the discrepancy between the desired product and the actual product has to be far greater than in the city because, as I said, there are fewer customers who can be even competed for. And of course, it's also the case that all the other people in the village also have a job. So you have one baker, you have one butcher, you have one car repairsman, and you have one person running a shop. And all the other people already have a job. It's not like the car mechanic wants to stop being a car mechanic and start opening a shop to compete with the shop owner. So yeah, I think just you're making a mistake there with your economic logic.
Well, I mean, in one sense, it could be easier to make certain changes in the sense that, for instance, if a small village have regular meetings at some city hall, then I can easily find a plan. If everyone is dissatisfied with a local business owner, they might hold that business owner accountable and socially demand him to be better. And if he refuses, well, then can make some sort of social arrangement of having a competitor. So in that sense, it could be easier to have deliberate local plans than in the city, perhaps. But yes, it's sorry.
May I address this point? Because that's exactly a sign for me that it's in fact not easier. Because in a city, people would just go to a different shop, and it takes for me a much smaller disagreeability to just switch to a different shop which is on the opposite side of the street rather than to go to a local village meeting and to actually be so dissatisfied that I will bring it up in the meeting and organize some social action. I will just go to a different shop if I'm in the city, and that's far easier. And that's why even smaller dissatisfaction leads to a change in the city.
Well, but you're just one customer, and to notice real change in market demand, etc., that would take longer periods of time. But if there is one city hall meeting and there is discussed this bad businessman, then they can just make a deal right at a spot that, okay, we are going to have a competitor if we do not improve.
Well, I guess I can't say any more than I have said now. Of course, if only I am dissatisfied with the service, then it doesn't matter anyways, even in the village or in the city. And if many people are dissatisfied, then my argument still holds. But I'm not thinking we should pursue this much further unless you absolutely want to.
I don't have much more to add necessarily. So we could move on to some other subjects too.
Yeah, I guess it would actually even be a good time to close this call because we have been at it for 1 hour and 3/4, and we have discussed 3 interesting topics, 2 of which I enjoyed particular. And so I guess for me it would be okay, but what do you think?
Yes, good points. I believe we have had a productive and substantial, if that's the word substantial to be used here, live stream which have lasted for, let's say, 1 hour and 43 minutes or so, and that's a considerable length. So yes, we could sum up here. I think we have had many interesting points and comments, and several topics that are interesting and significant, and also relative to everyday lives. So once again, we see how philosophy deals with practical life. It isn't this idea of, oh, just abstract things. No, it's about things that involve human beings and their lives, and their lives generally speaking. So yes, I would then say thank you, Amos, for having this discussion in this live stream, and thank you to the audience for having provided comments and suggestions to the topic. We hope that you enjoyed it as well. So yes, my final comments would then be thanks again for a live stream, and I would then wish you, Amos, and the audience a good weekend.
Yes, absolutely. Particularly, I wanted to say thank you to the audience. This is, I think, yeah, we had a couple of interesting comments, and I really enjoyed them, and I hope you enjoyed the show as well. And yeah, perhaps come look in another time again. And I also wish and thank you, Christopher, for the interesting conversation. And then I wish you all a great weekend.
Great. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Great. Goodbye, everyone.